Right now, let's bring in our first live guest. It's Dr. Mark Scott, University of Arkansas, Assistant Professor of Practice. Mark, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing excellent this morning. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Pleasure to be here. Real pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you, Mark. Normally, when we get people from U of A on the show, you and Dooner have them called the Hogs, but we'll let you stay away from.
We're going to let him slide this time.
We're going to let him slide. We'll let him slide this time. And we're talking about what's going on in the supply chain with what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, because even though this is a conflict centered between those two countries, it's really having global impacts right now. So let's kind of touch on some of those right now. Those broad-facing impacts. What are you seeing?
Okay, well, really broadly, I think it's a multiple-pronged situation. I think at first we have what could be happening in closer proximity within Europe, right? So what I would call first-order effects would be issues with food supply. The Ukraine and Russia have the highest production volumes of both wheat and sunflower oil, and that is significantly impacting food supply, would impact food supply quite significantly in the near to medium term. The other thing that is happening locally within geographic proximity is the shutting down of production facilities and manufacturing facilities, which is impacting employment levels, right? And impacting productivity in that particular area. And then, of course, we have gas and gas prices. Now, if we take a longer view or a more extended geographic view and look at some of the ramifications across Europe, we have a broader section of Europe, right? Obviously, there's gas supply, and Russia is the most significant gas supplier to many parts of Europe, and that is sanctions, potentially sanctions, as well as banks that are now placed or not allowed to engage in transaction on the SWIFT system. That can have some significant impacts on gas supply in Europe. Broadly beyond Europe, when we look at the world, that is where I think the dynamics get very interesting. We have food, right? We have food supply that we know, right, is hinged on Russian and Ukrainian, whether it be wheat or flour supply, but then it gets broader than that, right? When we look at what oil prices are doing, and the fact that oil and energy prices are significant input to cost in food production, we stand the chance to see a significant impact on food prices, I think, probably in the near future. The other thing that is very significant is metal prices, right? And between the Ukraine and Russia, they are significant producers and exporters of many of the different types of metal ores that are used across a plethora of products and processes. And I think that we've seen increases in prices, whether it be aluminum, copper, nickel, but there also are some other raw materials that are significant to that region and significant in subcomponents in manufacturing across the world. And those are neon, palladium, for instance, and they are significant inputs to a number of very important products we use. So that is where initially at a real high level, I see some impact.
So, Mark, let me ask you this, Doctor. It's when we look at the impact to the United States, and that's how we as Americans really look at most of the world, is how is it going to affect me, right? And we keep ourselves removed from things that way. And many times we're ignorant to what's going on or the impact or the importance of what's going on. When I look inside the imports, Russia is like 1% of our imports, right? Which is still a huge number. But when you're talking about these metals and these ores, et cetera, what is their significant impact around the world? Because 1% to us doesn't mean they're not huge trading partners for these ores, et cetera, that hit us on the second tier or third tier or fourth tier. What is that ripple effect? How do you see that playing out?
Oh well, how I see it is that we would see, or we could potentially see the impact here, because those ores are significant inputs to many products that we actually use. So think about microchips, for instance. We've seen a
Hmm.
significant microchip shortage across the globe. Well, one of the key inputs to microchips is palladium. And in the US, most of our microchip manufacturers use 100% of the palladium use comes from Russian production, right? We also have things like dental filling, medical processes, car batteries, wiring systems in cars. All of these things are components that are highly dependent on iron and metal ores, which in many instances, between 40% to as much as 100% of this is sourced between Russia and Ukraine. Let me give you an example. Some of the One of the metals used in uh, aero defense
Okay.
aircraft manufacturing is titanium,
Right.
for instance, right? We currently have manufacturers, whether it be Airbus or Boeing, right, that may be in contracts, right, that even though there are sanctions, there are contracts that now they need to be vigilant as to whether some of these contracts go 2028. They go beyond this current period, and we need to figure out, you know, do sanctions override these contracts, or do the contracts override the sanctions, for instance? And what that means is that we are going to see some suppliers of metal ores, different types of metal ores. It's very tough to find alternative suppliers because of the market penetration and the product base of some of these particular suppliers. So that's where I see it. I don't know if I got to your question there, but I'll take
No,
a
no,
go again.
you certainly did, and I'd like to ask a follow-up
Yeah,
if you don't mind.
go for it.
So you absolutely did, but it begged the question in my mind is this: you talk about we talk about all these different sanctions, right? And there are obviously those that are not sanctioning Russia. You've got and some that are abstaining from different things, China, et cetera,
Yes,
right? So
yes.
we get a lot of microchips, obviously, from China. So in the scenario you're discussing or talking about, like even the United States or even other countries that are sanctioning Russia, does this shift where they secure a lot of those products to? I mean, does China come out a winner on this type of thing? Because some of the things we would get directly from Russia or another supplier that is sanctioning them is now going to be sourced from somebody who isn't?
Well, that's a good question. And I think some of that we're left. It's very early to make a call on some of that particular type of dynamic. But what I would say is there are some elements, some metal ore elements. For instance, there are some where where Russia, sorry, right, literally controls 90% of the market,
Yeah.
and then for the raw material, and then 60% of that metal is purified in Ukraine. So though there may be sanctions, there are some instances where literal alternatives are not viable,
Yeah, they just
right?
don't. They just don't exist. In other words, right?
They
There
just
just
don't
isn't.
exist. They just don't exist. Now, there's something else I'll add on there, which is a very interesting dynamic to consider. Let us say, hypothetically, whether it be China or any other alternative source, origin source, to your point and your question, right? Well, there's the transactional part of the supply chain, where, for instance, there may be availability of goods, availability of products, or let's say there is the availability or alternative availability of this iron ore, any particular iron ore somewhere else. Well, then we get to the physical component of the supply chain, right? And the literal fact is, if we look at movement, so we have ocean and surface transportation, and we know of the port congestion and a lot of the issues with backlogs at ports across the globe. One of the things that had emerged to be a very relevant alternative was a bridge, so to speak, between Asia and the West, utilizing rail and surface transportation to Russia and Ukraine. So let's say, hypothetically, there is an alternative source. My hypothesis is that that alternative source, if it even be from China, there could be challenges in getting it out to the West because of what we're seeing, withdrawals of shipping to and from Russia and the Ukraine. There was a really nice rail link, or a pretty significant or emerging rail link between China and the West that was emerging through a route through Russia and Ukraine, and that now has been halted.
Yeah, good, solid points.
Absolutely. Mark, before we let you go today, I've got a quick question about the difference between sanctions and companies now choosing to, what I would call a boycott of choosing to use either Russian products or services, whether that be blanking passenger flights or blanking sailings or anything of the like. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between countries choosing to sanction Russia and these companies now, if they're kind of almost political posturing, or if they run that fine line between making a true choice to take the hit on their supply chains and looking like they're trying to do the right thing by choosing to boycott Russian products or services?
I think that's a very good question. And I think it is one that is very difficult to, well, somewhat difficult to determine what is the true impetus behind particular types of actions. So there's some cases where, so if we look at it from a high level and then distill or disaggregate down, it comes down to what we could perceive as something that is right in the sense of right towards humanity, or right in the sense of towards the business, right? Mm-hmm. And we're not sure how to differentiate, how to distill the actual driver behind the actions. But what I could say is, from my view, right, from a sanction perspective, if there are sanctions on Russia, right, there are often companies that have to, right, for geopolitical reasons and or for what we call future contract at risk value. When you look across a network that is served or look across markets that are served, there are particular values or value at risk to particular decisions. And I would posture that some companies that are now looking at value at risk to particular decisions are making decisions irrespective of sanctions to take particular actions because of monetary value at risk. The other thing is there's goodwill. And in addition to monetary value at risk, what may also be at play is that in today's markets, let's think along the likes of whether it be ESG-like or businesses that want to be sensitive to a sentiment in the markets and their customers. I think we could be seeing some of that at play. But I believe, make no mistake, from my opinion, that I would like to believe a greater percentage of what we're seeing is an alignment to a particular perspective, in alignment with the actual reason for the sanctions. That's what I believe.
I would agree with that, Mark. I think we also, just to further your point, is consider the fact that some of these companies, there are the instances where if they were to follow their values, they end up hurting another portion of the population that really isn't part of their thing, and so they need to continue to do some of that business, right? There's that situation as well, right?
That is a brilliant point, right? So when we talk about there is a fine line between a decision that is deemed to be right for humanity and then right for the business, because at some particular point the business serves humanity, right, and there is employment, productivity, broader ramifications that need to be considered.
Absolutely. Mark, I wish we could talk all day, and hopefully we'll get to talk again very, very soon. This was really, really enlightening and really great stuff. I really appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you so much, sir.
Anytime. My pleasure to be here. Have a wonderful day.